the Gospel of Mark. We want to continue through the Gospel together. And just a very short passage this morning. This is one of the great accounts in the life of Jesus. Very memorable for what he does, but also for what he says here. The Gospel of Mark, chapter 2, verse 13, and just down to verse number 17. Gospel of Mark 2, 13 through 17. Jesus went out again beside the sea, and all the crowd was coming to him, and he was teaching them. And as he passed by the sea, he saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax booth. And he said to him, "Follow me." And he arose, Levi did, and followed him. And as he reclined at table in his Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were reclining with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. And the scribes, the Pharisees, when they saw that he was eating with sinners and tax collectors, said to his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" And when Jesus heard it, he said to them, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I came not to call the righteous, but sinners." And all of God's people say to that, amen. Well, here is one of the more memorable little accounts in the Gospels. You probably know this account because of these little proverbial sayings. I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. Physicians don't give help to those who are well, but help those who are sick. You might know these wonderful sayings of Jesus, and very excited to preach on them today. Here is in this section of chapter 2 of Mark's Gospel, as I mentioned last Sunday, this is now the second of 5 little episodes, little accounts, where Jesus does and says something that gets him into hot water. The religious authorities, the scribes, that we would call them today, something like the lawyers, the religious elite, they're very knowledgeable, the very details, the jots, the tittles, the crosses of T's, the dots of I's in the Old Testament, but also the traditions of the strictest party of the Jewish leadership called the Pharisees. And so he gets himself into hot water, but it's better to say that not just that he gets himself into hot water, he wants to get into hot water, doesn't he? Last Sunday we saw that, where they bring down this guy who is a paralytic, and they rip a hole in the roof, they lay him down, and they're sort of whispering and muttering and mumbling and thinking in their own hearts about this very thing. And Jesus tells them that his sins are forgiven first, so that they would bicker and mutter about, only God can forgive sins. This guy's blaspheming. Jesus knows this. He wants to show them that he's the Son of Man with authority. And says, okay, fine. Then get up, rise again, and walk away. Jesus wants to get into hot water. He wants to get himself into trouble so that he can show that he's the eternal wisdom of God, and he can confound the wise so that the simple might find light in darkness and find a straight path amidst all the chaos of life. And so the same thing again. He calls Levi here, we see in this story, this sinner, this tax collector, and there are the scribes, the experts in the law, who are saying, why is he associating with sinners? Jesus did this on purpose so that he can preach the gospel to them. He gets himself into trouble. This is the second of 5 stories then, coming into conflict with religious authorities. He went out again, we read here in the beginning of verse 13. He went out again, just like we saw in chapter 1, verse 35, as he went out, he rose up early in the morning, he departed the place where he was sleeping. He went out to a desolate place that he might pray. So he goes out again. This is Jesus' pattern in the Gospel of Mark especially. There's this pattern where Jesus does a miracle, he proclaims the good news of the kingdom of God, and then he goes away by himself in a desolate, private place, oftentimes praying very early in the morning. The crowds are large, and his popularity is on the rise, and the crowds are so big, of course, we saw that they're following him everywhere he goes. And as he lays his bed in the house and he rises up, they find out he's there, and they come and they crowd the house, and you can't even get in. Even the doorway is packed, so they have to climb up on the roof and rip holes in the ceiling so that they might find Jesus and see him and talk to him and find a miracle and healing. He's being exhausted. He's a human being. He's God in flesh. Don't forget that. This is not just God walking around in a fake body as a ghost. Okay, this is not the Halloween Jesus, right? This is the real Son of God in human flesh. He's tired. He's exhausted. Life is difficult to be Jesus of Nazareth. So he goes out again. Why? To pray, to be alone with his Father, to have fellowship and communion with God, to be refreshed in his soul that his body might be able to continue to minister in healing and in preaching. And this time he goes out, notice, not to a desolate place or the wilderness, as we saw in chapter 1, but where does he go? He goes beside the sea. Okay, so it's the Sea of Galilee. He's in Capernaum, the very northern part of the Sea of Galilee, the very northern part of the Promised Land. He goes out early in the morning, no doubt, beside the sea. So he's going out into the wilderness and the sea. These are Old Testament images we've seen. Wilderness was a place of desolation and death. That's a place of exile. That's the place where you don't want to go if you're God's people. So Jesus goes out and he identifies himself constantly with the plight of his wandering, sinful people. But now he goes out beside the sea. Not just a geographic reference. Although he's in Capernaum, which is a fishing village on the Sea of Galilee, to say that he goes out beside the sea, like going out into the desolate place of the wilderness, is to say, in Old Testament terminology, he's going out to the place of chaos and conflict. Why do the nations rage? The nations are like the sea, that are chaotic and that are topsy-turvy, that are like waves crashing upon the shore, trying to sweep away God's people. He goes where the enemy is. He goes where the action's at. He goes to the wilderness to battle the devil. He goes to the sea that he might battle Satan and that he might be amongst the clamor of the peoples who are against him in conflict. I might say, I'm going to go off script for a moment here. I have to say this as one application, not only of what Jesus is doing here, but the whole principle here, what Jesus is doing as he's calling sinners. He's living amongst sinners. You can't get away from sinners, brothers and sisters. Moving out of California because it's crazy is not the answer to your problem. Going to a red state, suppose it. This used to be a red state. Don't forget that. Okay? We had Ronald Reagan, of all people, used to be our governor, right? This used to be a red state. So we have to remember that God puts us where he puts us to serve him. He puts us in the wilderness, and he puts us amongst the sea, as it were. He wants us to live among sinners. You can't run away. Okay, that's our application. In the early church, of course, they tried to get out of society. They made monasteries. They lived on, there were these great saints, these godly men. Why? Because they left the cities, they went out into the desert, and they lived on pedestals, poles, like these great columns, and they would live up on top of these columns. And people said, how godly is this man? He's left the ungodly city behind. And now look at him. He's up there. He's dependent upon us for food and water. And there's, famous stories of even great saints who lived on pedestals who were covered in rats because they didn't care about their bodies. He only cared about their personal communion with God. We've got to live among sinners, loved ones. We can't hide from sinners. We might think we can go to a certain country, a certain city, or a certain state, or, we're going to escape the chaos. We're going to get a better political situation. We're going to get more Christians amongst us. It's going to be heaven on earth. And what are you going to find out? Sinners, right? Sinners! Come on, you can't get away from sinners. So he goes beside the sea. This is an image of chaos and conflict and death and desolation. He doesn't hide from it. He goes to it. God calls us to go out into the world to serve him. All the crowds coming to him. Notice he can't get away from them. He wants to go out to be in private with his Father. The crowds coming to him. We read that again in chapter 1, verse 45. And what does he do? He responds to their need. He teaches them. He teaches them. That's why I have come out, he said in chapter 138. I have not come just to do signs and wonders. Those are meant to testify of my words. I've come out to preach the gospel of the kingdom. I've come out to teach. And so he does that. So what do we see here in this wonderful story? We see Jesus as he's by the sea, followed by a sea of humanity, teaches them in his words and his deeds this amazing, amazing gospel message. I came to call sinners. I came to call sinners. Notice the first thing here, verse 14, the call of Levi there, the call of Levi as he passed by. So he's gone out, he's coming back, he's passing by the sea. He saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax booth. Now, what's interesting, a lot of things here, but just really quick to mention one. If you look in chapter 3, which Lord willing we'll get to eventually, look in chapter 3 at verse 16 and following, when Jesus appoints his 12 apostles, and he sends them out, right, to minister. He appointed the 12, we read. Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter, Rock. James, the son of Zebedee, and John, the brother of James, to whom he gave the names Boanerges, that is, sons of thunder. Andrew, and Philip, and Bartholomew, and Matthew, and Thomas, and James, the son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, and Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. Now, Jesus here is calling Levi, come follow me, and Levi gets up and follows. But yet, when we read the list of the apostles, whose name do you not see there? Look there again. Do you see there the name of Levi mentioned in that list? Interestingly, not. In Matthew's gospel, the same thing. In Matthew's gospel is a list of the apostles. Matthew chapter number 6, verses 14 to 16. Again, the same list. No Levi, interestingly, no Levi. But, go over to Matthew chapter 9 for a quick moment. In Matthew 6, we have this very same list. And then in chapter number 9 of Matthew's gospel, look at verse number 9 and following. It's the same story that we're reading of here in Mark chapter 2. As Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man named what? Are you there in Matthew chapter 9? Notice verse 9. As Jesus passed on from there, it's the same story as Mark chapter 2. He saw a man sitting at a tax booth. What was his name? Matthew. Follow me. He rose and followed him. Notice the very same thing. He reclined at table, tax collectors and sinners. The Pharisees, the scribes are griping and complaining. They can't believe what he's doing. What do we see there then? Well, Levi is Matthew. Matthew is Levi. We read in Matthew 10, verse 13, that he's called Matthew the tax collector. The same exact term, the same exact phrase, title that Levi is given. He has two Jewish names, two Semitic names, Levi or Matthew, Matthew or Levi. This is the gospel writer, as we believe. This is the gospel writer. One of the apostles, but also a gospel writer. He was this notorious sinner. Jesus didn't call the righteous. He didn't call a Pharisee of Pharisees. He didn't call a scribe. He does that later, of course, with the apostle Paul. But his original apostles, he calls these notorious sinners, Matthew or Levi, the tax collector. He sees him, notice, sitting where? At a tax booth. At a tax booth. So, the equivalent of going to, the county office in San Marcos. There, you go there, you pay your property tax, your marriage license fee, your business license fee, whatever the fee might be. He sees Levi or Matthew sitting at the tax booth. Again, Matthew calls him the tax collector. Levi, the tax collector. There were two kinds of tax collectors in Roman society. There were those who collected income tax, or what was called poll tax, just for existing. You had to pay tax, right? So the old adage that we as Americans like to lament normally every April 15th, right? This year it was like July 15th, but right, there are two inevitable truths of being an American. What are they? Death and taxes, right? So to be a Roman citizen, to live under the umbrella of the Pax Romana, the peace of the Roman Empire, It was to pay an income tax or a poll tax. Just for existing, you had to pay tax. That was one kind of a tax collector, okay? The other kind were, we might call them customs officers. They were at bridges, so that for the privilege of crossing over a body of water. The Romans built a great bridge. They were great bridge builders, great architects and engineers. Just for the privilege of crossing over a bridge, there would be a little booth. You would have to pay a custom tax for crossing a bridge. Or if the Roman Empire built a state road, right, kind of like a toll road today, you'd have to also, before you got on that road, pay a certain tax. Now, there are inscriptions in ancient Asia Minor, or today modern-day Turkey, of the Roman Empire that describe very interestingly that there were also fish tax collectors. So there were income tax and poll tax collectors. There are also those who literally lived on, or who stationed on roads, who collected bridge tax, road tax. But there were also those, and they were complained about, that set up shop in fishing villages like Capernaum, and you go out in the morning, early in the morning, you throw out your net, you make your huge catch, you bring it in, and lo and behold, what do you got to do? The tax man cometh, right? You got to pay your fish tax. Levi, or Matthew, it seems at least by implication, by inference, was a tax collector on fish, okay? And he's there in the city of, or the town of Capernaum, on the Sea of Galilee. Which men has Jesus called who were fishermen who lived in Capernaum? Peter, Simon, and Andrew. Look in chapter 1, verse 16. That's the call of Simon, or Peter, and Andrew. They probably knew him. They were fishermen. And Levi, Matthew, is the tax collector for the town on fish. They knew this guy. Do you think they liked him? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. So there were two kinds of tax collectors, and no doubt he's one of these customs officers collecting polls, or collecting taxes, on fish. Each district of the Roman Empire, how did he become a tax collector? Well, each district in the Roman Empire would be assessed a tax burden. So every sort of city, as it were, every neighborhood of a city, of a region of the Roman Empire, had a tax burden that was set at the beginning of the year. Okay? And people would vie for the privilege of being the tax collector. How? They would auction it off to the highest bidder. So let's say, the tax burden for Carlsbad was $1 million a year. The tax collectors would come in, they would bid, and they would vie, and eventually the highest bidder would get it. And let's say he bid, I'm actually gonna pay you $1.1 million, and Caesar says, great, I'm gonna get some benefit. Now, the tax collectors were notorious crooks. They were notorious for what was called tax farming. They would not only have to pay the $1.1 million that they had bid in auction to the emperor, or to in this case Herod Antipas, the ruler, the king of the Judeans, but they would also then they would collect more taxes than necessary. Why? Because that was their profit. So whatever you gathered above and beyond what you had already been agreed upon by contract to pay the king, the governor, that was profit. Do you think these guys wanted to live like paupers? These guys, tax collectors, lived high in the hog, we might say. These guys were rich of the rich. And he would have been a Jewish man, Levi, Matthew. These are Jewish names, but he would have been a Jewish man because the Romans didn't want to impose themselves. They wanted you to feel like it was a privilege to live under the Roman Empire. And so a Jewish man, Levi, Matthew, collecting tax on fish, which was the number one economic thing in Capernaum, and they knew him. They knew him. But why is it so significant? Why doesn't he just tell us, like he did with Simon and with Andrew? He called them Simon and Andrew, and just called these two men. Why does he say that he is at a tax booth? Because in the Jewish writings of the time, tax collectors were classed amongst murderers and thieves. Tax collectors were the same class as murderers and robbers. In fact, as a Jewish man collecting taxes for the imperial Roman Empire from your fellow Jews disqualified you from serving as a judge in Jewish society, disqualified you from being a witness ever in a court of law, and third and most importantly, as a Jewish man collecting taxes on Jewish people for the Roman Empire, that was automatic excommunication from the synagogue. In other words, this is a rich man, but he is a notorious sinner. He's an ostracized sinner. He has no part in Jewish society. He's despised. He's hated. He's vilified. So Jesus passes by this tax booth, sees the local tax collector there, this Jewish man, Levi, Matthew, collecting taxes upon the number one economic aspect of their little city town culture, fish, and he says something to him. To this excommunicated, hated, ostracized man. Does he spit on him? Does he take his sandal off and dust the dirt off as a way of shunning him? Does he grimace at him? Does he give him the evil stink eye, right? Follow me, he says. Follow me. A Jewish rabbi saying to a notorious sinner, follow me. And what does he do? He rose. He rose and followed him. He rose and followed him. Now, we just saw the paralytic. The paralytic, Jesus said, rise, get up, walk out. Now, these are two different verbs. In chapter 1 of the paralytic, or chapter 2 of the paralytic, it's a different verb, but they're related verbs that speak of resurrection, of new life. He rose and followed him. He's just healed a paralytic. He's just done a miracle in the sight of the Pharisees, and they were in awe. We never saw anything like this, verse 12 says. And now he raises, so to speak, a tax collector. Do you realize that it's just as much a miracle? It's just as much a miracle of the power of Christ and the grace of Jesus Christ to say to a sinner, follow me, than it is to say to a paralytic, rise, take up your bed, and walk. Do you realize that? That's what Mark is telling us here. The paralytic stands up and walks out. Jesus tells this tax collector, follow me, and he rises up, literally from his seat in the booth, but symbolically to new life. It is just as much a miracle when a sinner calls on Jesus' name and follows Jesus than it is to raise the dead. Just as much. The new life that Jesus gives to sinners like you and me is as much a work of powerful grace than it would have been if he would give you a new limb if you had lost one, heal a disease if you had one, etc., etc. Just as much a powerful work of his grace. Follow me, he says. He rose and followed him. J.C. Ryle, in his comments on this text, says just a beautiful line. Levi here, the tax collector, the notorious excommunicated sinner. Ryle says it like this: we ought never to despair entirely of anyone's salvation when we read this passage of Scripture. We all know notorious sinners. We've been notorious sinners. But we all know someone who wants nothing to do with Jesus Christ. We ought never to despair entirely of anyone's salvation when I read the story of the call of Levi. Amen? This is a sinner. And if Jesus can save this kind of a sinner, he can save anyone. Notice, secondly, verse 15, there is now a communion with sinners. As a call of a sinner, Levi, now there is a communion with, or a fellowship with, not just him, but other sinners. As he reclined at table, In his house, many tax collectors and sinners were reclining with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many. Notice that. There were many who followed him. Why is he here now in Levi's house? Luke tells us in chapter 5, the parallel story in Luke's gospel, that Levi, out of an abundance of joy, after he had been called by the Lord to follow after him, he invited him and his disciples to his house for a banquet, a celebratory banquet. Why? He had been saved by grace. He's ostracized by all of his fellow Jews. He cannot step foot into a synagogue anymore. He cannot even serve in civil society. He has no status in civic or ecclesiastical, we might say, parts of society. He's a sinner. He's shunned. Jesus says, follow me. And then he, out of an abundance of joy, hosts a meal. He tells his fellow tax collectors and sinners, follow me to this man Jesus. And they're all there. This is the response of a grateful heart. With grateful heart, my thanks I sing, we sang this morning. Before the great, the Lord, my God, I sing. This is the response of a grateful heart to grace. Follow me. We get up and follow, and we serve the Lord. And notice the imagery of a table here. What is a table meant to communicate to our hearts and minds? They're fellowshipping at a table. Now, in those days, of course, tables were very low to the ground. They would recline on cushions. But nonetheless, what is the image of a table meant to communicate to us? Is it distance? One on one head of the table way over there and one way over there. No, not that at all. They're reclining around a table. What is it meant to communicate? This is close, personal fellowship. If I invite you to my house and we have lunch or we have dinner, I'm saying something to you. If you invite me out for Starbucks, or Tim, I forgot the name of your new gig, but if Tim brings me over for coffee, right? We're saying something. We're not enemies. We're not foes. We're friends. There's personal fellowship. There's love. There's communion together. You're bringing a person into your house, into the domain of your abode, right? And they're sitting with you at your table, the same posture, the same food, the same drink, conversing together. There's fellowship here. There's communion together. And this image of a table or having a meal together with the Lord is found throughout the entirety of the Bible. It's all around the Bible. What happened when God called Moses to Mount Sinai, and then he called Aaron with him, Exodus 24, Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, who go up, and then also the 70 elders. In Exodus 19, they had to stop halfway up the mountain. Only Moses could go. But then once Moses sprinkles the blood of the covenant, they inaugurate the covenant with the Israelites, then the Lord says, bring up Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, the 70 elders, and they go all the way up to the top of the mountain. Why? We read, interestingly, and there they ate and they drank. They had a meal with God. God invited them up in personal fellowship. We know the psalm, the most famous of the psalms, Psalm 23, the Lord's my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me down to lie. And there's that wonderful phrase toward the end of the psalm where it says, you prepare for me what? A table in the presence of my enemies. My cup overfloweth, right? The imagery of a table, fellowship. Here all the enemies of David surrounding him, trying to kill him. And God and David are fellowshipping together in the wilderness around a table. The prophet Isaiah, for example, Isaiah 25 has a very powerful image of a day to come. If you turn there just for a quick moment, Isaiah 25, just notice verse number 6. Isaiah is, of course, prosecuting the Israelites, the Judahites, for their sins. They're going to be in exile one day. But the prophet gives glimpses of grace. And in chapter 25, there's this amazing image of grace where we read this, Isaiah 25, verse 6. On this mountain, notice again the imagery of a mountain, the Lord of hosts, of heavenly armies, will make, notice, for all peoples, a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wine, of rich food full of marrow, of aged wine, well refined. Now notice that. Food and drink, the best food, the best drink, the best of fellowship, the best banquet, the best celebration. Who's invited, the prophet says? For all peoples. For all peoples. And then we fast forward in our minds all the way to the very end of the story, Revelation number 19. There's that very famous image of the wedding feast of the Lamb. Who's there? All the nations. Surrounding a table. All the nations there eating and drinking and feasting and celebrating with one another and the Lord. And so Jesus reclines in ease and in comfort and in familiarity at a table in Levi's house amongst many tax collectors, many sinners, and his disciples, because many followed after him. Note who's invited. Note who's invited. Many tax collectors, like Luke, and sinners. So the tax collector thing I just mentioned, the tax collector thing, Levi is a particular kind of tax collector, and they're vilified by society. Nobody likes these guys. We get that. And sinners. And sinners. What do you think of when you hear that phrase? Tax collectors and sinners. On the one hand, it might sound very simple. Well, it is very simple, but it might sound to us like tax collectors are very specific and sinners are very generic, right? So everyone is a sinner, and there are these particular kind that Jesus wants to minister to in this context, tax collectors. That is true. But both phrases are very technical phrases, especially this language of sinners, if you were a first century Jew. It's not just that he had fellowship with tax collectors, but he had fellowship with a particular technical category of people whom the Pharisees despised. And they were all called what? They were all called sinners. So it's not generically meaning everyone, which is true, but it's technical and specific for a class of people the Pharisees considered to be inferior because they were not interested in their very strict traditions of the law. This is a phrase that's used not of all people, but specifically of fellow Jews. Sinners who were not Pharisees. Pharisees, those strict and those set apart and those separated from, and those who are higher than, superior to the rest of the Jewish society. Sinners were those kinds of people who were less than, below them, the Pharisees. They called them sinners. They called them the people of the land. Why? Because unlike the Pharisees who were dedicated to God, sinners were common, unwashed masses, we might use that phrase, the unwashed masses. And the Pharisees said amongst themselves that, imagine if I was a Pharisee, that I would not be able to even enter your house. And if you were a common person of the land, a sinner, and you invited me, the Pharisaical pastor, to your house, I wouldn't be able to go. If I did, guess what happens to me? I'm excommunicated. I'm unclean. I am now a technical sinner. So he invites to himself Levi, and he has fellowship with many sinners, those whom the Pharisees were scandalized by. They weren't even worthy of their time. You would never, as a Pharisee, even discuss the things of the law with the common, unwashed person of the sinners because they are unclean. But what does Jesus do? He welcomes them. He welcomed welcomes them. He invites them. Follow after me. And when Levi tells his fellow sinners, I am following the Lord and I'm having a banquet at my house, come. And they all come to hear, what is this? Who is this crazy a rabbi who would even dare to have fellowship with us? And there he is at the table reclining with them. On this mountain, the prophet said, I will have a feast for all peoples, and here are the all peoples. Here are the all peoples, sinners, spoken to by Jesus, talked to by Jesus, physically close with Jesus, eating from the same food and the same cups with Jesus, welcoming them, welcoming sinners, welcoming sinners. And I might say then, as one way of applying this to us, do you want that for our church? Do you want this? Do you want this for our church? Sinners to come and follow Jesus. Do you want to tell sinners who don't think like you and who don't look like you, who don't act like you, who don't whatever like you? Do you want to tell those kinds of people, them, I follow Jesus, follow me? Jesus here is telling us that you don't need to be therefore of a certain color or a certain class, a certain status, a certain culture to follow after him. No, he calls sinners. He calls sinners. He calls those like Levi. And again, he's a Jewish man. And these other sinners and tax collectors are Jewish people who've been beaten down, we might say, by the church, who've been ground down to dust by their leaders, who've been beaten down and despised and spit upon and shunned and ostracized by supposed believers. We need to find those people and say, come follow me as well. And Jesus says to us, in our context, in an election season, you don't need to be of a certain political party to follow Jesus. It's amazing how every single election season this comes up. Shouldn't be amazing, right? It's human nature. We're all humans. Do you need to be of a certain political party to be a Christian? Or to put it the other way, can you be a Christian and vote for a Democrat? And I know some of us are thinking, no, there's no way. There's no way you can. Find that in the Bible for me. Find that in the Bible for me, and I'll preach that. He calls sinners. He calls sinners to himself. And every year, or every 4 years, is the worst of our own particular persuasions and our political ideologies. It always comes out, doesn't it? It always comes out. Jesus calls sinners, though. Jesus calls sinners. Notice, finally, the controversy that this brings. The controversy that this brings. That he's welcoming these kinds of sinners. What a controversy. Again, at the Pharisees. Verses 16 through 17. The scribes of the Pharisees, right? These are the experts in the Pharisaical traditions. When they saw that Jesus was eating with sinners and tax collectors, those whom they were not allowed to as Pharisees, they said to his disciples, why does he eat with tax collectors and technical sinners? Verse 16. In other words, we can sort of put the shoe on our own feet. Why would you ever hang out with a Republican? Why would you ever hang out with a Democrat? Why would you ever, dare I say, hang out with a libertarian? That's the import of what they're asking, what they're saying, right? We're of this class, this party, this club, this ideology. They're over there. There's no togetherness. There's no fellowship. There's no commonality. So they ask that. Why? Why does he do this? Why does he do this? Jesus hears it, notice. It's probably because, well, it is because the scribes don't actually come into the house. They can't. And so they're probably at the door, and there's a commotion, there's a knock or something, and the disciples go out, and Jesus hears them saying this outside. They won't even come in. They can't come in. And so he says two of his more famous little phrases here. It's really one big, but two little famous Jesus proverbs. Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. Now, what's interesting is this. That first little line there, this sort of little poetic line, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. That was actually a Jewish proverb. That, interestingly, the Pharisees accepted as true. The Pharisees accepted as a Jewish tradition this phrase, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. You see what Jesus is doing again? He does this so much. He confounds them in their wisdom. He uses their very own terminology, their very own worldview, we might say, in our time, so that he might twist them up and use their words against them. He uses their terms, and what he's saying is that because we all agree that those who are well don't need a doctor, but only the sick, that therefore means that I have a responsibility to heal the sick, to heal sinners, to bring to them a remedy for their problem. Because this proverb is true, I must do this. Right? So they're on the horns of a dilemma. We have our proverb that we accept as true, and now Jesus is applying that rightfully. What do they do, right? What do they do? They're on the horns of a dilemma. Some, like Nicodemus, of course, believe in Jesus, but of course the majority didn't, and they hatch up a plot to bring him to the cross. I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. And just like sinners is a technical term, so is righteous. The Pharisees are those who called themselves the righteous, and everybody else, the sinners. I didn't come here to play word games with the scribes and the lawyers and the experts. I didn't come here to call those who in their own minds think of themselves as already on the pathway to heaven and good to go with God. I didn't come here to call those that already think of themselves as part of the in crowd. No, I came to call everybody else. I came to call the sinners. I came to call those who are beaten down by the church. I came to call those who are despised by the society. I came to call those who are ostracized and alone and sinful and unclean and who know themselves to be this. I didn't come as a doctor to give medicine to those who don't need it. I came to those who are dying. I didn't come to bring into my kingdom a club of people that already are a part of the club. I came to welcome into my kingdom those who are enemies. I came to befriend those who have no friends. That's what Jesus says here. That's what he says here. And so Jesus teaches in this wonderful little story, in his words and by his deeds, the gospel. The gospel. He calls the most shunned in society, like Levi. He welcomes the most outcast of sinners, like this group in this house. He heals the most sick. But notice how he does this. Notice how he does this. Yes, he is like a physician or doctor. Yes, he heals, but he does so by his word of forgiveness. He does so by his word of welcome. In this case, he doesn't perform any signs, any wonders, any miracles. No, the gospel is the sign, the wonder, and the miracle. That he simply speaks, follow me, and miraculously, this man follows him. And miraculously, a crowd of men just like him follow after Jesus. How can Jesus do this? How can simple little words, follow me, how can they have such power behind them that people who would never follow after would do so? Because this is the power of the gospel. The gospel word of forgiveness, that God forgives sinners like notorious men, like Levi, notorious people like you and me. The word of forgiveness is the power, is the miracle. That God would be merciful to me, a sinner. That God would welcome into his kingdom me, an outcast. That he would embrace someone so unclean like me. Do you know this Jesus today? Do you know this Jesus? Have you heard this wonderful word for yourself? If you don't know Jesus today, if you don't know this wonderful word, he says to you today, follow me. That's as simple as that. Follow me. Follow me. And as you follow him, you will know what it is to be forgiven. You will know what it is to be welcomed into a kingdom. You will know what it is to be protected forever and ever and ever until that day when you see him face to face. Follow me, he says. Follow after me. And for us, brothers and sisters, the message is the same for us to follow Jesus, to hear his word of forgiveness, mercy, and grace, to be welcomed into his kingdom, to be assured of that for ourselves, and therefore, like Levi, responding in gratitude to the mercies and grace of God towards him. It's the same call to us. It's the same call to us. As Levites, as sinners, as tax collectors who've been forgiven, who've been welcomed, we must forgive, we must welcome those who are what we once were, to follow Jesus, to find forgiveness, to be welcomed into a kingdom that's not of this world, a kingdom that doesn't go after the colors of blue or red, doesn't have a D or an R after them, or an L, libertarian. I got to throw the libertarians in every once in a while. A kingdom that has no end. We just confessed that. A kingdom that has no end. Where sinners of all stripes, all sins, all sizes, all colors, all cultures, and so forth are welcomed,